Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Israel. I am the founder, dean, director here at Sevenaria University. It's great to have you. If you're seeing me on Facebook or YouTube, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Click on the bell icon as well for updates about videos that are coming out. Okay, and it's good to have you back here at Sevenaria. Once again, my name is Israel. I'm glad to bring this presentation to you. It's called "Were Ezekiel's Wheels UFOs?" or UAP. Now, tonight we're going to explore that by talking about the history of UFOs and talking about the history of UAP as well as we know it in the last couple of years, but mostly focus on the idea of UFOs. Okay, and we're going to see if we can find a version of a UFO story, a sighting, a close encounter of the first, second, third, and fourth kind in the Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel. Okay, we're going to look into that tonight because, it's a pretty known story that Ezekiel saw things in the sky that even to the shallow reader seems like a strange story of a UFO encounter. But we're going to really get into that. Okay, so I'm looking forward to that. So we'll be right back. Okay, we're back. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the history of UFOs as it pertains to what the U.S. military knows. Now, I am not really privy to inside information from the U.S. military, nor am I even claiming to have such information. I am simply in this presentation going to explain to you what I have heard on UFO documentaries, of which I've seen many, of what I've read in books, and of what I've heard from word of mouth. Okay? I have no personal affiliation with the military, nor do I have any interaction with the military whatsoever. I'm simply repeating the stories I've heard from most of what I've read and seen about UFOs. And I want to really make that clear. What I will be doing, though, is giving you my interpretation of these stories, including the interpretation of Ezekiel's wheels. That will be my interpretation. Okay? So let's go for it. All right. In the 1940s, in 1947 to be exact, um, they the pilots from World War II were returning in their airplanes, and they were saying, now keep in mind, World War II is really the first war where we really had, airplanes. We had larger planes, we had smaller fighter jets that were, fighting each other in the sky in dogfights. These pilots were returning and saying, hey, while we were up there flying around, we saw little lights that seemed to be independently controlled that that the French pilots are calling Foo Fighters. And these American pilots and world pilots were complaining about these Foo Fighters because they couldn't pick them up on radar, but they obviously were around the plane, and there were photographs taken in the Arctic of these things, and that they were independently controlled. And obviously, a problem if you're flying through a bunch of these and they're just like all around your plane. The pilots, no matter how calm that pilot is, the pilot's going to start FO, freaking out. So they were reporting these things as Foo Fighters. And the word foo in French means fire. So they were called firefighters or Foo Fighters. And why were they called firefighters? Because they were glowing, fiery balls of light. Glowing, round orbs of light that look to be, for lack of a better term, look to be on fire. Excuse me. Excuse me. I'm sorry about that. That look to be on fire in the sky. And so they called them Foo Fighters. And they also had reports that the Foo Fighters would approach the airplanes. So in other words, the airplane would be flying, right? And the Foo Fighters would approach the plane, make circles around the plane while the plane was flying. Whoops. That would be funny if it were flying backwards, huh? While the plane was flying, they would make circles around the plane. And the pilot said this scared them to death about the Foo Fighters because they were interrupting the flight path of these planes. Some pilots reported that these Foo Fighters came close to the airplane. I have to pause for a minute. And as they got close to the plane, beings would step out onto the airplane. You know what I just said? Beings. Hominoids. Would step out onto the airplanes, my friend. The wings of the airplane. And they called these creatures gremlins. Yes, it's true. Yes, it's true. These creatures, that's where the name comes from, gremlins. In fact, I'm 51, and when I was a kid in the 80s, there were still some older guys fixing those old cars in the old 20th century that was still saying that they, before the movie, that they had gremlins, in the cars you have a gremlin. And when the movie came out, then everyone knew. They were like, oh yeah, that's what they called the old aliens. They called them gremlins, and they came home from the war and they followed people home and messed with their cars, and they called these guys the gremlins. And they said, the pilot said these Foo Fighters would drop off the gremlins. This is a Foo. And the Foo Fighters would drop off the gremlins on the wing. Okay? And the gremlin would walk across the wing into the cabin of the plane. It would walk across the wing into the cabin of the plane. This is what some pilots reported. Okay? Let's do that so it's separated. And while in the cabin of the plane, our little gremlin friend here, right, our little buddy, would start talking with Mr. Pilot. And he would say to the pilot, "Why are you doing this?" And of course the pilot would respond, "Because I'm under orders. I'm a soldier. What are you doing?" And these gremlins would say, "We live here. We live here on this planet with you. We're here with you. Why are you flying your airplanes into war with cultures that we are all living here together? What's happening?" And the pilots, of course, would have no answer. They would say, "Oh, we're flying into war. What are you doing in my airplane?" And these gremlins would suddenly make the entire plane malfunction. It would malfunction. and the pilots wouldn't know what to do. It would be a complete mess. The gremlin would mess, or this fool, the fool fighter, would mess with the plane. And the pilot would not know what to do in this situation. And what would happen is the plane would begin to crash. It began falling out of the sky. And as it begins falling out of the sky, the pilots would report. Now, this is in the old UFO documentaries. They don't talk about this so much anymore. But the guys who are listening to this that know the UFO stories, they know what I'm saying. They know it's true. These guys would report. They would scream for help. Please don't crash my plane. Please, what are you doing? If it's you, stop. Fix the airplane. And they would communicate with them as the plane was falling. They would say, how do you feel about this dying situation now that you're falling into the earth? How do you feel about this? And the guy is obviously panicking and screaming, please stop, hey. And they're crashing towards the earth. And he said the gremlins would talk to them telepathically. They would talk telepathically to them and say, how do you feel about all of this? And they would say, oh, we hate it. And they say, once you screamed, you don't want to do it. You're just under orders. Under orders, they would fix the plane. And the plane would suddenly rise again and start flying straight. It would be fine. But all the while, the Foo Fighters surrounded the plane with their man on board, you see. Mr. Foo man, Mr. Foo. Mr. Foo's on board. And Mr. Foo walked across the wing to get inside. Miraculously, he got inside, they would say. They don't know how. And this crashing, fixing scenario happened a few times. And it was reported that this walking the wing thing and all that happened. So the guys in World War II would come home, back to the base, land there and say, get debriefed and say, well, okay, Mr. Debriefer, want to know what happened up top? Want to know what happened up there? This happened up there. This happened up there. While we were up there, these guys came in. That's what happened. And the debriefer would say, this is nuts, but would take the stories. And the stories we turned in. And it just so happened at the time, one of the generals at the time was General Twining, General Nathan Twining, the Air Force. This is the Air Force. This is Air Force, the old Air Force. And General Twining was the general at the 1947, when these guys were landing and talking about these Foo Fighters they saw up there. They start a project. The U.S. military wants to know what these things are. And they definitely want to know who these guys are. They start a project called Project Sign. Now, Project Sign is a very cool name, I think. I always thought so as a child. I always thought, wow, they must have thought it was a sign from God. That's immediately what I thought as a child. When I saw this, I said, they must have thought it was a sign from God, that these were gods, that they thought these were a sign from God. So they named the project. Anyway, whatever it was, Project Sign. General Twining had Project Sign go on, and what they did was they went up to the Arctic. They went up to the Arctic, where a lot of these reports were really coming from, because they had to fly, certain flight paths, and they were getting close to the north. They went to the Arctic, and what they observed in the Arctic was amazing. They observed amazing things up there. What General Twining said he observed in the Arctic were ships with the ability to take off round. First of all, he said he saw, let's say this is water. I should explain this. This is ice. And this is water. And this is more ice. They're up in the Arctic. General Twining reports in his report in Project Sign that he saw aircraft approximately the size of known aircraft. It's planes, big planes, meaning that if you stood people next to it, you know, they'd be this big, okay? And these things were independently taking off and landing on the ice caps in the Arctic, which was impossible for human beings to do, which was an impossible task. You needed 30 guys, 20 guys to get an airplane fueled up and thawed out. And you can hardly do it because you can't stay long because of the ice. And these things were going in, onto the ice and off the ice independently, not needing anything, right away, landing, staying, leaving. And what's interesting is that Twining reports that he also observed them going into the water. He also observed the UFO in the water. So they're in the water, they're on the surface. And they call these USO. And this is a USO because it's unidentified submerged object. And the USOs would go under the water. And this is freezing cold water. This general in the U.S. Air Force is reporting, General Twining is reporting he's seeing these crafts flying up, off, and back down onto the ice and into the water independently, submerging under the water and leaving the water. He reported all this. And he says in his report that the objects are not fictitious. The objects are not fictitious, but approximating the size of an aircraft. Okay? So just take a look at that for a second. And when you are a general and you're saying that the objects, UFOs, are not fictitious, then you know that this is a serious thing. And so right after this, they got rid of this. Right? They got rid of this. And in the 50s, they created Project Grudge. And Project Grudge was obviously, to my young mind again, obviously they were saying that because this general had come back with a positive report about these things, that they had a grudge. They wanted to know who these people were. They probably thought they were some kind of breakaway society that was inventing things that weren't telling the public at large and just keeping it secret on some island somewhere maybe they didn't know about. It was the 1950s. And maybe just using these things without permission from the agency that controls the air, the FCC, I think it is. I forget what it is. So they got rid of Project Sign, which was, it's a sign, and they got Project Grudge. They couldn't communicate with them. Now they're mad. This is my mind. As a young man hearing these things, this is immediately what I thought about, and I still think this way. So they created Project Grudge, and Project Grudge basically within a year found the same findings, got the same findings together. and interviewed the same pilots, and the same stories, kind of stories were told surrounding the aircrafts. Fewer stories, but some of them approaching into the aircraft and all of these type of things. And Project Grudge was immediately batted down again because they started interviewing the civilian witnesses. This was another thing too. They started including, well, hey, there was a civilian that saw it. I'm not the only one. There was a guy on the ground that saw it, a girl on the ground. So they went and interviewed. So Project Grudge began interviewing civilians, and they killed it because the civilians were like, yes, there was a round disc in the sky, and it was moving at 200-300 miles an hour, and suddenly stopped and hovered in front of an airplane, and blah 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 blah. So the Project Grudge was immediately, within a year, it was taken down. It was done. They can't, no more Project Grudge. Forget about it. And what they did was, now they had to control the stories. They had to control the witnesses, the public at large. People are seeing these. And why? It was a threat to national security. They thought this was a threat to national security. That's what the U.S. military thought. That's what the government thought at the time. That they didn't know if it was their professed, at war, in the Cold War, their professed enemies, or someone else. They had no idea, or if indeed it was really actually aliens from another galaxy coming into, or another planet, or another space coming into our space. They had no idea. They still have no idea. They call them UAP now, unidentified aerial phenomenon. Back then it was unidentified flying objects. So they are unidentified flying objects. So immediately they figured they have to control the narrative. Control the narrative. And the way they controlled the narrative was they invented, or didn't invent, they created Project Blue Book. And Project Blue Book was basically a disinformation campaign. If someone saw a UFO, they would say, oh, it's swamp gas. For example, I know that's one of the more famous explanations. Or if someone saw a bunch of UFOs flying, they would say it's a flock of birds. So these are the kind of things they were saying. No more Foo Fighters. Forget the Foo Fighters. Swamp gas. That's what you saw landing in that field. That's what you saw landing there. That was swamp gas. That wasn't a UFO. That wasn't a, what? You saw, you saw things in the sky flying, and there were lots of them, and they were white and shiny and really moving really fast. Must have been a flock of birds. That's what they were doing. Must have been a flock of birds that you saw out there, Larry. Okay? Just calm down. You must have seen a flock of birds. Okay? You must have seen an airplane. Okay, calm down. This is what Project Blue Book was. Calm down. It's swamp gas, flock of birds, plane. Anything but this. Anything but this. Anything but this. It's anything but this. It's pigs flying. They were pigs. They got shot out of they fell on a trampoline and they flew over the fence on the other side, and you saw them in midair. Anything but this and this. This is what Project Blue Book was. Pretty funny stuff. But then they got rid of that too. Dr. Allen Hynek headed Project Blue Book. And he was an interesting character. He was a guy who wore a silverish beard, a goatee beard with cat eye glasses and short silver hair, and he was in his tie and his shirt, very, very professor-like. And he was recruited by the U.S. military to study UFOs, Dr. Alan Hynek. And Dr. Dr. Alan Hynek uh, worked for the U.S. military for quite a while. And he eventually claimed in the 70s, when this was all done, that he wasn't happy with these conclusions, that they forced him into these conclusions, so that the swamp gas one that he found in that where he was there in that location was not, he believed, swamp gas, but that he was forced to say it was swamp gas. And that the flock of birds that was clearly on the video that we all have seen of those independently moving lights against a blue background was clearly not birds, but something else, okay? And they were too large to be birds, first of all. We've all seen these videos over the course of the years. These videos are 60 years old. And so they've been around for a while, and that's good old Dr. Alan Hynek. You know, show you a picture of the man himself, who would later go on to form the UFO organization on his own, and you know, he would go on to study UFOs throughout the 70s. Okay. And he would, as I said, claim that all of this stuff was forced upon the public, and that it was, as he said, a disinformation campaign. So again, I am not saying what I'm just saying what was said by Dr. Alan Hynek, okay? So that's what happened with the U.S. military's involvement with UFOs. Okay, so go ahead and just examine that a little bit. We talked about the Foo Fighters. And as you can see, the Foo Fighters were around in 1940s, flying with those fly guys and gals up there in the skies, and they were coming home and going, "Hey, what's happening up there? Are those ours?" You know, and the U.S. military, of course, was like, "Those are not even close to ours. We can't do that kind of stuff." And so they had these examinations. You know, they had Project Sign with Twining. He freaked out, saw these things and said, "Hey, they're real objects." Then we had Project Grudge, which obviously they had and it knocked that down too. I bet you a lot of that stuff happened. Project Grudge, and then they had Project Blue Book, which probably didn't, it didn't care. They didn't care. They just called anything what it was. They just called UFOs anything they could. Okay, so, all right, so now I'm going to try and do something else here. We're going to go back a little bit to UFOs in history. Okay, from like the cave walls. Okay, so like it's interesting because when you like look at UFOs, a subject, it goes all the way back to the beginning. So I want to talk about that. And they painted these contacts. So in Tassili al-Najir, there are interesting paintings of aliens, what we would call aliens, and I'm going to show you a few of those. Now, I do want to credit where this article, it's called The Evidence of Ancient Astronauts in the Cave Paintings of Tassili al-Najir. And I found it online, okay, from Strange Places, okay? But the paintings, the pictures they're showing is really what I want to show you, okay? So it's really interesting in that when you go to these cave walls, now these are ancient places, okay? Well, when you go to these cave walls, you're finding that on the cave wall. Okay, what does that look like to you? That doesn't look like a human being, okay? Give me a second, let me... So you find that. Now, if you look at that carefully, that is clearly a being, some sort of being, and you can see that it has protrusions, if you will, coming off the top of its head. Okay, just look at that. There's protrusions coming off the top of its head. It has a deer in its hand, and it's flying over the sun and the moon. Okay, so what are we to make of that? Look at that, it's clearly got a helmet on. Okay, so this is for educational purposes only, okay? So that's why I'm using this. There's something reminiscent of Egypt. And look, there are many of those people we saw in the beginning. See them there? The helmets. There they are again with these helmets on. And they're giving animals to this larger helmeted creature. These are all on cave walls in Tassili al-Najir. Look at that, they're offering animals with their helmets. What's going on? Is this a collection, a scientific collection here, as being described? Look at these beings. Okay, so we're talking about aliens, and Tassili al-Najir is a great example, but there are places in, like, for example, France, where you can see other shapes, such as the famous shape found on the French cave walls in France, or other ones that have the same appearance but have dots moving this way. Okay, those are simple or other dots. These are simple graphics to understand. The ancients saw this. They painted it just like they painted cows and other things on their cave walls. Okay, they did these things, and then they saw these. Okay, and that they did. This is what you see on the walls of the caves when you enter into these ancient places where people lived from time to time. What are we to make of this? I know what I make of it. It's pretty simple to me. Okay, so moving on past the caves, we go into the highest culture possibly that ever existed because of their place in time and what they were able to accomplish in Egypt. Kenneth. Now, by the way, we get the word chemistry from the original name of Egypt. We also get alchemy. This chem is very serious. It's chem. Chemistry, alchemy. Chemistry, I know, is spelled with a C, right? With alchemy. Anyway, Egypt. Here, the Pharaoh Thutmose III, he saw 3 independent rings in the sky. And they lasted for 7 days. They were numerous. Thutmose III. Okay, so he saw those for 7 days. Those were 7 rings. Then we have the Pharaoh Akhenaten. Okay, the Pharaoh Akhenaten saw what he called the Aten. That's in fact where he got his name from. Okay, Akhenaten. And he saw what he called the Aten in the sky. And the Aten spoke with him and told him to stop worshiping the other gods. It was a monotheistic creature. And Akhenaten the Pharaoh left the original location and built a new city to worship the Aten. This happened. And his brother was Thutmose, but not Thutmose III. And I believe here at Sevenaria that Thutmose became Moses, or Moshe. Thutmose, the brother of Akhenaten, became Thutmose, who dropped the Tut, having left Egypt, and simply became Moshe, and returned after Akhenaten was killed with the Aten, the one God, who would become Yahweh, Aten, the Yahweh, and left with all of Akhenaten's followers and more. And so that's just a side, we're kind of digressing. So Akhenaten built this city, and it was destroyed by the priests 20 years later. It lasted 20 years. But he had a UFO experience, and he I can, show you who he was. Okay, this is Akhenaten. Now they always call him the UFO Pharaoh, right? That's Akhenaten. And that is his famous Aten. That's his famous Aten. You see, he's praising the Aten, his wife Nefertiti, and their children. The spirit of his children appeared. But that's the Aten. And you can see it's the sun. Or it is something that looks like the sun, but it's a UFO. It's alive. It's talking to him. Some people say it's sun worship. But, he claimed it was alive. And it was inhabited. And so this is the story of Akhenaten in a very simplistic way. He met the Aten, called himself Akhenaten, built a city, they destroyed it, and then they moved back to worshiping the gods. And this God, I believe is Yahweh. That's what I believe happened. That his brother Thutmose became Moses. Okay, so we're going to move on from Egypt, and we're going to talk about that in the Renaissance. In the original Renaissance, there was airships painted. Okay, and I can show you a few of those. Which you really just have to look up the airships of the Renaissance. And the airships of the Renaissance were airships of the Renaissance paintings were actually quite interesting. There were scenes where some of these Renaissance paintings showed figures shielding their eyes and looking up at UFOs in the skies, raining down light. There's paintings all through the Renaissance that look like this. and you can find them. You just have to look them up online. Paintings of the crucifixion of Christ, where Christ is surrounded, as he is on the cross, he is surrounded by UFOs. Okay? And there are pictures like this. There are UFOs surrounding Christ. Just have to look it up on the internet and find the Renaissance paintings of UFOs, and you'll see them. And you'll understand that people were seeing them. In the 15th century, there was a sighting where there were balls of light in the sky, and people saw them fighting each other. They were fighting each other, and people looked at them from the ground. And this is recorded, that these lights shot at each other and fell to the ground, and great smoke came up from the ground after these lights fought in the sky. And you can look up these wood cuttings. Well, from there we move into the 1800s. And, excuse me for a second. Marker here. And in the 1800s, you had reports of UFOs. They were called airships. Now, some people think these were dirigibles, the first kind of, things that people were flying around in. But that was the problem, because these things were not just simply floating. They were flying. They were moving really fast. They were landing. People were coming out of them, and they were getting back in them, and they were flying back up. And they weren't talking about little baskets at the bottom. What these people were talking about were silver discs flying. Some of them had propellers. Yes, that's true. One or two of them had rudimentary wings. But most of the reports were about bowl-shaped objects which contained windows and contained people. Okay? And that they flew across the countryside. These airships flew across the countryside, and people would see them. Okay? And so these were interesting objects that were reported to have crashed on a farm, on the Proctor farm, and an alien was found, and they dumped it down the well. They buried the alien, but they dumped parts of its ship down the well, and presumably confiscated the other parts. But the alien was buried, and they were sure to say they gave it a Christian burial. So these were the type of things people were seeing before World War I and World War II, when the sightings in the military would happen. Now, what happened outside of the military, like public sightings? Right? What happened? Well, you had Kenneth Arnold, who was the first really to report a UFO. He was flying his Cessna aircraft, and he saw in the distance boomerang-shaped objects that were flying, he said, at 2,000 miles an hour, and that were making erratic turns and were able to fly in erratic ways. And he came off the flight and reported these, and he said that it looked like saucer skipping on water. They flew like a saucer skipping on water. And this is where you get the term flying saucer. because Kenneth Arnold reported his things he saw up there flew like saucers skipping on water. The reporter called them flying saucers, and the term was born. Okay, so that's the Kenneth Arnold sighting. Well, that happened in the 1940s, right around and before Blue Book, right around before Project Sign. Then in the 1947, we have both a public and a military sighting at the same time. It's Roswell. But it's not only a military sighting, one comes down on a farm, crashes in a rainstorm on a farm. A guy named Mac Brazil is startled by this explosion on a farm he's watching in the rain the night before. So the next morning he goes out and he finds, he thinks a plane crash. He found so much stuff. He says he thought a plane crash, so he calls the military. He calls the military base. They send Jesse Marcel. He's the intelligence officer. He knows every kind of plane and flying object there is. This man is the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomber Group. The 509th Bomber Group is the bomber group entrusted with atomic weapons. In fact, sadly, they were the bomber group that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in the 40s, the 509th Bomber Group sent Jesse Marcel, their intelligence officer, to the farm where Mac Brazel was staying and watching, because Mac Brazel thought a plane had crashed in the storm the night before, because he saw a lot of crash debris. Jesse Marcel arrives out at the scene, and he says he finds in a documentary that would come out in the 1970s that was hosted by Leonard Nimoy of Star Trek fame. Jesse Marcel would have an interview and said he found a debris field 700 feet long and 500 feet wide. I kid you not. I kid you not. That's what he said. He said there was stuff he did not recognize in this debris. And so he called for a truck. He put as much of it in his truck as he could. And he took it back to the base. And when he got back to the base, they were all, over this stuff. All of them were all over it, including the fire department that showed up at a later date as well, that took some of the stuff back. And there were some firemen that reported some strange objects. But Jesse Marcel and the military was all over this stuff. And they thought they finally found a flying saucer. They thought they found one of the flying saucers. And so they went on the radio on July 4th, 1947. The U.S. Army has recovered a flying saucer, the report said. The disc was taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where Army officers are taking care of it. taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base with Jesse Marcel. And they reported it. How were they able to report this? Because it was July 4th. And all of these generals were away from town, away from Washington, away from their posts. And this thing crashed on July 3rd. And on July 4th, this Jesse Marcel recovers this on the 4th of July. And they report it. And no one's around to stop the report from going out. So they report they find a flying saucer. And it's all over the news. But on July 7th, 1947, why do I keep doing that? They have Marcel come in, and he would later report that in the same program, In Search Of, that he would later report that he was forced then to pose because they wanted to knock this down, this report down. On July 7th then, he was forced to pose with tinfoil and to say it was a balloon. So basically there was a cover-up. And from there we've learned about the cover-up for Roswell. That's all we've ever learned about. But if you put all the pieces together like a detective, you'll understand that something real happened here. Forget everyone else's testimony if you have to. Just listen to Jesse Marcel on In Search Of. Listen to what he says on that old program in the 70s. And you piece the thing together by what this man maintains. And you'll find the truth. And then there'll be other truths to find as well. This radio report, and this is proof. Something happened in that desert that they're covering up. Period. Okay? So let's move on. We're going to talk about one of the last sightings before we get into Ezekiel. Okay? And that's going to be the story of, and I'm just talking about some touch tone, contacts, because obviously if I was talking about every contact, the video would be hours long. Touch tone contact. Betty and Barney Hill. This is an amazing story. Betty and Barney Hill were a married couple in America, in New Hampshire, driving along a road in New Hampshire. And here's a picture of them. And Betty and Barney Hill, in their car, were driving along and having probably a really good time, talking and laughing. Old style car they were getting around in, driving up the road. And Barney reports that he saw what he thought was the moon. But he said it was kind of strange because although he was driving and he was conscious that, movement, that the moon seemed to be moving. That it was moving. And he couldn't understand why. And they kept driving and driving and driving. And this moon kept moving and moving and moving. And they were driving, moving and moving. So Barney decides to pull over to the side of the road. He and Betty pull the car over to see what's really going on here. And Barney gets out of the car and with a pair of binoculars begins to look at what he thinks is the moon. Betty stays in the car. When he looks at what he thinks is the moon, he sees a row of windows. And he sees in these windows people looking back at him. This is what Barney reports. And Barney says he immediately began to panic. He went into an explosive panic and went back into the car, and they drove off with Barney hitting the gas. And they drove and drove and drove and drove. And they said the faster they drove, the more this object pursued them. And it pursued them until they heard 3 beeps. And they blacked out. Next thing they remember, 3 beeps. And they're on the road again. Almost in front of their house. Almost in front of their home where they live. That's all they remembered. 3 beeps, 3 beeps. This area here was going to change everything for the whole world. That area, that blackout. Barney started having nightmares. He couldn't sleep. And he went to a doctor. And he discovered that he might need to see a psychologist. After talking to the doctor and telling him about these strange dreams he's been having, is keeping him awake. And they said, "Oh, you need to see a psychologist. You have some sort of weird mental trauma." He goes to see the psychologist, and the psychologist recommends that he goes to see another psychologist. One who knows about this new phenomenon called UFO abduction. Now, it wasn't even a phenomenon. It was just barely spoken of. And as he saw this psychologist, he put him into deep regression. And Barney remembered what happened that night. These guys came off the ship and they approached Barney. And they took him and Betty on board this craft with them. And they laid them down on beds, and they did things to them. They did things. They experimented on them. They took semen. Barney said they took semen from him. Betty would later remember they stuck a needle in her navel. But what's interesting about this is Betty would remember a star map they showed her, of lines and different lines going. And they told her, this is where we come from. She would later draw this map, the Betty Hill star map. And no one knew what it was about until 1970s when a woman named Marjorie Fish, I don't want to spell her name wrong, Marjorie Fish took this map and said, I think I can figure this out, and started trying to figure it out by hanging golf balls off her ceiling and laying under them in different positions to see what it all looked like. But it was only until after a certain star was discovered in the galaxy that we know in the 60s and the 70s, a star was discovered, that Marjorie Fish was able to hang this one star that she was missing. And this system was then known as Zeta Reticuli. So Betty Hill remembered a map that turned out to be true. Turned out to be true. So they had some kind of contact, so that's proof. The thing that took them in had some kind of contact, because her map, where they showed her they came from and where they had traveled to, turned out to be the star system Zeta Reticuli, which Marjorie Fish laid on her floor for years to figure out until they couldn't. It was impossible for her to figure it out until they found this other sun, till they discovered this star. Then she put it and she figured it out. So this is incredible. This is, and there's a couple of star maps because the Dogon of Mali have their star maps of the Sirius, the star Sirius, and there's Sirius A and Sirius B, which was only discovered in the 60s or the 70s or something like that. And they've known about that for hundreds of years. Sirius A and Sirius B. And they have a rotational map displaying the rotation of the two planets. You know, it's a structure like this, and you have the planets here, here, and here, and you have a specialized rotation that they can show you. It's really pretty amazing. Okay, so that's basically the history, without getting into the abductees, because here you have abductees. When we move into abductees, that's the 1950s and 60s. And these were people who said they had been abducted by these guys. After Betty and Barney Hill, then a whole bunch of people flooded out. Actually, before Betty too, because Betty and Barney Hill came out in 1961, but they were guys in the 50s who were talking about this abduction thing. But the abduction, and they said they were having babies with these aliens that eventually came out. But then they were taking them to Mars and Jupiter and all of these other fantastic stories they were telling. And you know, there was a pilot that was staying out in out in the desert in California, and he was supposedly in contact with aliens that would land out in the desert, out in the desert out there with him, and in contact with him. So these abductees were interesting people. I'm not really going to get into their names or who they were, because again, this UFO thing has been going on for 70, 80 years, okay? It could take forever on a video. So they were abductees. They really believed that these things were taking them. They provided some photos, and that's about the extension of it. Then we get into the 1970s. Well, the 1970s offered, before that, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Hollywood went crazy with this. Because when these Foo Fighters were reported, of course, it was big news. The underground guys coming home talking about flying saucers. Hollywood went crazy with this. And there were UFOs, stories, and movies, and alien movies dominating everything. Okay, we know that. We can look up and see all of the UFO movies that were made, all the way up until the 70s, through the 70s, with great films. Like The Day the Earth Sits Still, for an old one, that's in the 50s. And then you have in the 70s, of course, you have movies like Alien and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. There are other great UFO films and alien films of the 70s, and forgive me if I'm forgetting them. And then you move into the 80s, of course, with the more sci-fi. There was then sci-fi is really what it is. It just incorporated the idea of not just aliens, but other worlds. How could I forget Star Wars? Of course, Star Wars, right? So there were huge efforts to show the public about the deal about UFOs. Okay, so that's the deal, UFOs in history. So now let's get into our topic, because we spent a long time doing this. So we'll get into the topic we've come to talk about. In fact, let me flip it right over, because we're already prepared on the side. Okay, so we're going to talk about Ezekiel's wheels. Were they UFOs then? So, I took you through that whole trip because I want you to get an understanding of what these things were, what they were doing, that they were round, and that they had people occupying them. That's all I want you to hear. Okay. So now we're going to get into our topic tonight. Were Ezekiel's wheels UFOs? Now, who is Ezekiel? Well, Ezekiel is a character in the good old Holy Bible. And Ezekiel's book is what is known as the book of the prophets. He is in what is the section of the Bible that's called the prophets. And of course, there are 12 prophets, 12 major prophets. And Ezekiel is one of the major prophets. Okay? He is a pretty popular prophet for many reasons. And one of them is his UFO stories. And he was a priest before the captivity. His story takes place during the captivity of Babylon, of Israel and Judah. So they were in the first captivity, and he's sitting by a river. And we're about to talk about what he sees. Okay? All right. So I'm going to be reading from the book of Ezekiel, and I'm also going to be trying to illustrate what I'm reading. So I hope I can do it, as they say. So this is the book of Ezekiel. Let's read. Ready to read? Do some reading. All right. Now it came to pass in the 13th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river of Shibar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. So the heavens were opened, and he saw visions of God. In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of the king of Jehoiachin's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly unto Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Shibar, and the hand of the Lord was there upon him. Okay, so he's sitting on the ground by the river. Okay, and he's looking at the clouds. So we're there so far, right? Ezekiel chapter 1 verse 4, and I looked and beheld a whirlwind came out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire unfolding itself, and a brightness was upon it, and out of the midst thereof as the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. So he looked, and a tornado came out of the north, a whirlwind came out of the north, and a cloud came out of it, a big poofy cloud came out of it. And he said, and out of the cloud came the likeness of amber, like amber color. He saw something shining, amber, right, out of it. Now, you know, if you've ever seen the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that Steven Spielberg completely lifted this scene. Oh, was that George Lucas? No, it's Steven Spielberg, right? Completely lifted this scene from this book when they come to take the child from the woman in Indiana. The scene, it's brilliantly done too. I love that movie. It's one of my favorite films. But when she's standing in the field and she can see the brightness unfolding with the storm clouds, it's absolutely this. It's also this when they approach at the end, when they're at Devil's Tower and the clouds are unfolding. He does a brilliant job of recreating the scene without having to be, biblical about it. All right, so let's move on. So I looked, and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north, and a great cloud, and a fire unfolding itself. Out of the midst thereof is the color of amber out of the midst. So he saw what we're looking at. He's looking at this, right? To put a little look dots, right? He's looking at that. So far we have a pretty mundane scene here, except for this light in the sky, but that could have been caused by the sun, right? It could have been caused by the sun over here shining on the clouds. And people say, okay, it's the sun. But let's check this out. He says, out of the midst of it, where's my marker? He says, out of the midst of this came the likeness of 4 living creatures. Out of the midst of this came people, 4 living creatures, he says. And this was what their appearance was like. They had the likeness of a man. They were male. They were male. They had looked like a man. And everyone had 4 faces, and everyone had 4 wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. And they had the hands of a man under their wings and on their 4 sides. So let's draw that out. There were 4 of them. Each one had 4 faces. It says each one had 4 faces. And each one had 4 wings. Now, I'm going to draw the wings the way I know they're going to be described, because I already know the way the wings are. So I don't want to, I don't want to not draw properly, because we're proceeding through this, right? Each one had 4 wings. And their feet were straight feet, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like the color of burnished brass. So they had and when I think this is a mistranslation personally, that feet meant legs, but that's okay. It's neither here nor there. That feet meant legs. So I'm trying to draw as big as possible, because you gotta, I want you to see this. So they had feet like a calf's foot. So it was a hooved feet, right? So they were hooved. So they had feet like calf's feet. Now this could have been misinterpreted, right? It could have been that they were wearing some sort of boots, right? They were actually wearing some sort of boots. And they had the hands of a man under their wings on their 4 sides, and they 4 had faces and their wings. So they had the hands of people. They had the hands of people. All right? And their wings were joined one to another. And they turned not when they went, but everyone went straight forward. And he's looking at this. All right. As for the likeness of their faces, they 4 had the face of a man, the face of a lion on the right side, and they 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and they also had the face of an eagle. So they had 4 faces. They had the face of a lion on the right side, mm-hmm. The face of an ox on the left side, the face of an eagle on the backside, and the face of a man in the middle. And they all had these features. So let's carry on. Thus were their faces and their wings stretched upward, 2 wings every one joined one to another, and 2 covered their bodies. And they went every one straight forward. Wherever the spirit was to go, they went, and they turned not when they went. So suddenly he introduces a new character, the spirit. Who is this new character? Wherever the spirit went, they went. And we'll find out. He goes on to say, as for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, and like the appearance of lamps. Okay? So they were like burning coals of fire. Okay? And there's the appearance of lamps. So we have a pretty neat description of what he's seeing here. Okay, he's seeing some backlit creatures that are appearing to him as lamps. They're shining. Okay, this is a really detailed report he's giving here. They're shining. And the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of a flash of lightning. That's very UFO. Today, the UFOs are reported as moving swiftly. They'll be traveling in one distance, in one direction, all of a sudden change, and all of a sudden change, and then traveling very fast and do zigzags, and come back. They fly. They have the ability to do extremely strange flight paths, and the flight paths have been recorded on film. And here's Ezekiel 3,000 years ago, and the living creatures ran and returned as the appearance of flash of lightning. Now he goes on to describe. I mean, if this is not enough, right? Now, as I saw these living creatures, behold, one wheel upon the earth by the living creatures with its 4 faces. So he's sitting on the earth. This is the river. All right. This here is the river. All right. And he sees a wheel. He sees a wheel sitting on the earth. He sees a wheel. This is really bizarre, isn't it? He sees a wheel sitting on the earth. And let's see what he says. The appearance of the wheels and their work was like unto the color of beryl, and they 4 had one likeness, and their appearance and their work was as it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. So he not only sees one wheel, he sees 4 of them. And it looks like a wheel in the middle of a wheel. Look familiar? But you know, he's saying it's on the earth and it's a wheel. So we're supposed to think like these are wheels, you know, like okay, yeah, sure, wheels sit on their side, and he's seeing wheels. But I'm going to tell you, this is exactly what it's not saying. And I'm going to show you why. This is what we imagine he's saying. This is what all the artists have drawn. This is what all the artists have drawn about these wheels, that they're sitting on the earth. And I'm going to tell you why this is wrong, because they missed a single line. They missed a single line in the Bible that explains why this is not what it is, but that this is what it is. And that he was looking at it from below. And they say, how could it be below if it was on the earth? Looking up at it, looking up at them from below. Possibly perched on a mountain. Yeah, possibly perched on a hillside. But let's move on. So on the earth, he sees these wheels. He says, and the appearance of the wheels was like unto the color of beryl, and therefore had one likeness, and their appearance and their work was like it were a wheel in the middle of a wheel. Now this is what they always miss, which gives them this, which should give them this, but they always overlook this part. When the wheels went, when they went upon their four sides, right? A circle has four sides. 1, 2, 3, 4. A circle has four sides. Look, a circle, 1, 2, 3, 4, has four sides, if you really look at it. Because if you lay a cross in the middle of a circle, then you have four sides, okay? A circle doesn't have any sides. But if you want to turn it into a four-sided thing, then you have to put a cross in and get 1, 2, 3, 4. So he says, when they went upon their four sides, and they turned not when they went. See up top? Turned not. That's super important, those two words. Turned not. They went upon their four sides, but they turned not. In order for a circle to go upon its four sides, it must turn. It must revolve. So how then could wheels such as this be moving but not turning upon their four sides? They're in motion, but he says they did not turn upon its four sides. So they're moving, but they didn't turn. Okay. In order for a circle to go upon its four sides without turning, the circle must become flat. And therefore, as it moves along, it's now moving on its four sides without turning. As opposed to this, it's this. He was looking at this, not this. Because, as it says, they went upon their four sides, 1, 2, 3, 4, but they turned not to do it. Which is verse 17, they turned not. So which means, in my opinion, they had to do it like this. So he was looking not at this, my friends. Erase it from out of your mind. Get it out of your mind. It's been wrong. Completely wrong. This is wrong. He was looking at this. And he was looking at four of them. How about that? That's proof. He was looking at this. Let's move on. Verse 18.
As for their rings, they were so high that they were dreadful, and their rings were full of eyes round and about them. What do you see? Full of eyes. I think those are portals. And you'll see why those are portals. 19. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them. So they were on the earth, yes, and I beheld upon the earth, but he also saw them flying. When the living creatures moved, these things moved with them. So he saw them as moving, as I said, like this. They didn't move on their four sides like this. They moved in their four sides like this. He saw them moving with the creatures. And when the creatures were, and the living creatures, they were lifted, and it says 19, I'm sorry. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. So he clearly saw under the wheels. He saw under them. He saw them. He saw what they were. And he saw them moving, not like this, but like this. And he saw them following these things. And he called them wheels. UFOs. They were discs. They were flying saucers. Flying saucers. 20. Wheresoever the Spirit was to go, now he starts calling them again the Spirit. The wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. Now we're getting crazy. Now he's saying these creatures, the spirit of these creatures was inside the wheel. He's saying the spirits were inside the wheel. That it was inside the wheel. The spirit of the living creature was inside the wheel. When those went. I'm reading chapter 121. When those went. And when those stood. And when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up over and against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. In the wheels. The spirit was in the wheels. We can't get any more clear, more lucid than this vision, than this UFO encounter. And the likeness of the firmament upon the heads of the living creature was as the color of the terrible crystal stretched forth above their heads. So literally, he says, above the heads of the living creatures, there was a helmet that looked like crystal. He called it the terrible crystal, which means strong. That strong stuff you can't break. The terrible crystal. He sees a helmet. That's verse 22. And under, he says, and under the firmament of their wings, straight one to another, everyone had two, which covered each side, and everyone had two. He describes the wing again. He says, and when they went, I heard the noise of their wings like the noise of great waters, and the voice of the Almighty, and the voice of speech as the noise of a host when they stood and they let down their wings. There was a machine. He heard a machine. When they moved it, he heard a machine. grumbling and rumbling around, and he heard this machine, and he heard voices. He heard the loudspeakers, possibly of the the God speaking. He heard the loudspeakers, and he said he heard the voices. He says, and there was a voice from the firmament that was over their heads when they stood and they let down their wings. So the what was over their heads was speaking, just like Jesus when he got baptized. There was a voice that came out of heaven, and above the firmament that was over their heads was the likeness of a throne, as the appearance of a sapphire stone, and upon the likeness of a throne was the likeness of appearance of a man. So now we have a man appearing on a throne, and of course we know that this is the Lord. We know that this is God in heaven, right? He sees him on a slab too. I'm going to include that before we get there. Okay. Now I want to go back to 2022. Okay. So it says, in the likeness of the firmament upon the heads of the living creature was as the color of the terrible crystal stretched forth above their heads. Okay. So they're talking not only about these helmeted creatures, but also about the creatures he's seeing in the glass as well, in my opinion. Okay? So he goes on, though. This doesn't end. Okay? So he sees the likeness of a throne and a man sitting in it. And I saw as the color of amber, as the appearance of fire round and about within it, from the appearance of his loins even upward, and from the appearance of his loins even downward, as I saw it with the appearance of fire, and it had the brightness round and about it. So there is a person sitting in heaven with a jetpacks that is emitting fire, okay? And it's emitting fire, okay? So that is a fully illustrated depiction of Ezekiel chapter 1. Good old Ezekiel at the bottom here. He looks up and he sees angels floating, and they've got wings and four faces, one of a bull, one of a lion, one of a man, one of an eagle. Consequently, these are the insignias of today's governments. Most of them. They have straight legs, and they have the feet that end in like calves' feet, hooves. And they have these wings going on here that are touching each other and covering the arms of each other. They're floating around in the sky under a whirlwind, under a cloud that they consequently came out of. He then looks around and sees wheels on the earth that he says that aren't turning when they're moving on their four sides. They're moving on their four sides, and they aren't turning these wheels to move on their four sides. They're moving, though. And he sees them lifting up from the earth and following these guys. And these guys following these guys. And they're flying in the sky. It's a UFO. And then he notices that they're all wearing these helmets of crystal. That there's a crystal helmet going on. And he notices that they're communicating with each other. And then he gets blown away by another vision. Someone on a throne appears in the clouds above these guys. A man on a throne appears in the clouds. This is Ezekiel's vision in the book of Ezekiel chapter 1, and that's just one of this man's visions. Take that in for a minute. Because Ezekiel had obviously had a UFO encounter. I mean, there is no doubt in my mind. I don't think there's doubt in anyone else's mind either right now. That's a UFO encounter. If you came to MUFON and said you saw wheels, circles in the sky that had glass in them, and people flying around, and they were coming out of the clouds, and you were sitting there and this was happening in the sky, they believed you, you would have one of the greatest UFO reports ever. This is one of the most detailed UFO alien. He had a close encounter of the first, second, third, and later in the book, we're going to learn he has a close encounter of the fourth kind because they take him. They come back for him, and we're going to do another video about that because this is the end of this video. They come back for Ezekiel and they take him to the temple to measure, to watch the angel measure the temple. And the angel is glowing like these guys. These guys are glowing like brass, and so are the angels. So when you talk about angels with little cherubim, with little babies with wings, that's not what the angels look like. They look like this. They're wearing helmets, and they're glowing like fire and brass. So the whole idea of the angel is wrong as far as a biblical angel. Four-faced, fiery, brassy beings from the book of Ezekiel. So were Ezekiel's wheels UFOs or UAP? Were they? Why don't you tell me? What do you see here? What have I drawn? I took the book and I just drew a detailed flash of what I read. There was a whirlwind and the clouds, and then these beings came out of the clouds, and all of a sudden you saw these wheels, and they were all acting there in the sky. You're sitting by a river. Is it swamp gas? Is this swamp gas? These birds? Did he see birds? Did he see swamp gas? I don't think so. And neither would Dr. Alan Hynek think that these were swamp gas or birds. He would agree with me. Something is going on. And it's been going on since the beginning of time. And it's in that Bible. And it's all over the Bible because Abraham saw UFOs as well. When Abraham gave his first sacrifice to God there, he cut up two animals. Sorry to be so crude about it. But in the midst of those animals, when he woke up, he said he saw lamps going back and forth. He saw lamps going back and forth over his sacrifice that he made to Yahweh. Abraham, when he makes the first day, he wakes up and he sees lamps going back and forth over the sacrifice, okay? Does anyone pay attention to that? I don't think anyone does, because those are UFOs. Those are the aliens examining what he did for them. Okay, no one pays attention. There are other UFOs in the Bible as well, okay? The Israelites in the desert spent 40 years. Let me say that again. They spent 40 years with a pillar of fire warming them at night, and a cloud in the day that rained manna down to them, fed them on the ground. For 40 years this happened. Does no one think that this is a UFO that followed them? They weren't even stationed. 40 years stationary, it's weird enough. 40 years they moved in the desert, and a fire at night to keep them warm, and a cloud in the day that rained bread called manna that they ate for, say it again, 40 years. Okay, there are the UFOs in the Bible. God lands on a mountain in Exodus, and the whole mountain's smoking. And Moses has to go up and see him, and God says, build a fence around this thing so that they don't come in here. I don't want them to come in here right now till we get this law straight. He has to build a fence. What? Okay, so there's UFOs. So I think Ezekiel's wheels were UFOs. I'm going to go out online. They were UFOs in an early date. And that's really what's happening. That's what's happening in this book.
This book has a lot of detailed UFO encounters. Okay? And so that's the proof. Okay? So I think we had a lot of fun tonight. This was a good one. We did one on UFOs. And I think people are going to dig the one on UFOs. It was a good one. All right? So I'm going to go ahead and erase Betty and Barney Hill and sign us out. Oh, better use a better marker than that. Won't be seeing anything. Oh. I really want to thank you guys for joining me here at Sevenaria. And the university was made to serve you with as much knowledge as I can gather and as much facts as I can gather and as much wisdom as I can gather. And I would say from tonight, look up and get your cameras rolling. Post any video you find under this particular video about Ezekiel's wheels and any videos we do in UFOs. Post the videos in the comments if you can. I'd love to see them. Look up and see what you see. We're being watched. And there's no question we're being watched. Okay? So I want to thank you guys again for joining me here at Sevenaria University. I'm Israel Joseph, the founder, dean, director, and professor here at the university. And I want to thank you guys. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube and click the bell icon for updates and new videos, okay? You guys are the best. Sevenaria into the future. Thank you again for being here. Blessings to you. We'll talk more again. Take care. Bye now.